Greetings and welcome to my channel, which I started to introduce you to short pieces that are in the public domain from my favorite genres and hopefully yours as well. I'm always on the lookout for literature that's scary, magical, mystical, or just plain weird. And today, I decided it's time to talk a bit more about what weird fiction is. Because even though there's often some overlap with horror, gothic, supernatural, fantasy, and other types of fiction, weird fiction may offer unique interpretations of tropes that we're familiar with from other genres, but very often exposes readers to previously unimagined horrors altogether. And based on what I've seen, some people make a distinction between true weird fiction and literature that's what I'm going to call weird adjacent, meaning it might not technically fall into the weird category in the narrower sense, which I'm going to get into in a bit, but there may be some overlap with that subgenre. And you might be able to see the influence of more traditional writers on weird writers, as well as what differentiates weird literature from more conventional horror or supernatural literature. So, on this channel, I use the word weird in a broader sense that encompasses both true weird and weird adjacent literature, because despite the differences, I feel it's all related, kind of like one great big weird family. So, to give you an explanation of the term weird, which I think corresponds with the broader sense in which I use it, in an article called What is Weird, Part 1, Fawn Ward notes that the word weird, which in contemporary usage often refers to something that's strange or unusual, stems from the Old English word for fate or destiny, weird. And historically, it often referred to phenomena that were considered uncanny or supernatural, often in connection with witchcraft. And for that, Ward says we can thank none other than William Shakespeare, thanks to the three witches, aka the Weird Sisters, in Macbeth. Ward notes that the word weird often has both positive and negative implications, which I feel is important to stress. Because even before I came across this article, I've emphasized at the beginning of my other videos that when I use the word weird, I mean that in the best possible way. On the negative side, for example, it's pretty common to refer to people who don't fit into a particular social group and who behave in ways that are outside some type of norm as weird. And categorizing people in this way can lead to ostracization and bullying. In its positive sense, Ward notes that, quote, weird is a beautiful, open-minded pathway toward thinking outside the box for the better, toward creating novel ideas or brilliant, unique art and well-written stories that we continue to desperately need. It can be a wealth of creative opportunity, end quote. In another article called Weird Fiction and Fiction That Happens to Be Weird, Wargaluk mentions weird fiction in the narrower sense, describing it as, quote, a distinct literary tradition related to, but possibly transcending, popular speculative genres like horror, sci-fi, and fantasy, end quote, with, quote, its own canon of authors and a somewhat insular industry of websites, periodicals, and small press publishers, end quote. However, as I do, Wargaluk states that they prefer to use weird in its broader sense, describing it as, quote, a quality or mood that can be found across a wide range of literary works, end quote. In addition to writers in the weird canon like H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, William Hope Hodgson, Algernon Blackwood, who I covered a few episodes back, and Arthur Machen or Machen. I'm sorry, I've read him, but I'm not actually sure how to pronounce his name. Their list includes a diverse assortment of writers of surrealist or speculative fiction, including Franz Kafka, Italo Calvino, Haruki Murakami, Kazuo Ishiguro, Philip K. Dick, J.G. Ballard, and Stephen King, who, as you might be able to see from the shelf behind me, I'm quite a fan of. Hey folks, just a brief editing note on Lovecraft, whom I've mentioned in past episodes and am going to be discussing again shortly. I want to make it clear that while I personally think Lovecraft is a brilliant writer, and I certainly think he's an important one to read if you're a fan of weird fiction or even horror or speculative fiction in general, his racist views are well known and often made their way into his works, and that is one aspect of Lovecraft's legacy that I am not cool with at all. I don't think we should try to explain this away by saying, well, those were the times he was living in, because first of all, I don't believe that's ever an excuse to have bigoted views, and just look at the times we're living in now if you want a good example of that. And also, I've seen people say that even for his time, Lovecraft's views were pretty extreme. My position is that I definitely believe we should read Lovecraft in spite of the views that he held, certainly if we enjoy this type of fiction, but also given his influence on contemporary writers like Stephen King, who, in a blurb on the back of my copy of Lovecraft's Great Tales of Horror, says that Lovecraft is, quote, yet to be surpassed as the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale, end quote. But I do believe that those of us in the US especially need to call out Lovecraft's racist views today, given the real-life horrors that we're seeing on a daily basis. And on the subject of King, kudos to him for using his work and his platform to speak out on said real-life horrors for the past decade. And I think Wargeluck's list works, even though it's a long one. But perhaps because using weird in a broader sense can potentially encompass so many different writers and works, I think now's a good time to consider what true weird fiction is. And for this, I think Frank Ormond gives us a good overview in what is weird fiction. Referring to this subgenre as the quote-unquote old school weird, Ormond notes that even though 19th century writer Edgar Allan Poe is often cited as an influence on writers in the weird canon, the specific concept of weird fiction didn't come about until the early 20th century, with William Hope Hodgson, author of, among others, The House on the Borderland and The Nightland, often referred to as the first true weird writer. One characteristic of weird fiction that Ormond highlights is darkness, and in describing this darkness, Ormond mostly defers to H.P. Lovecraft, who, in his 1927 essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, wrote that, quote, a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. End quote. This brand of darkness sets early 20th century weird fiction apart from the earlier literary forms that it evolved from, such as Gothic fiction and ghost stories, both of which were popular during the Victorian era. Another characteristic of true weird fiction is its portrayal of how the impossible interacts with the so-called real world, which messes with our worldviews and our conceptions of how things should be. In The Weird and the Eerie, the late Mark Fisher equates weirdness with wrongness, stating that, quote, a weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least that it should not exist here. Yet, if the entity or object is here, then the categories which we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. The weird thing is not wrong, after all. It is our conceptions that must be inadequate. End quote. Fisher describes elements of the weird as phenomena from an outside that allow us to reconsider how we see the inside, the mundane world that we think we know. This contradiction of our previous notions and understandings has a rather interesting effect. Citing Lovecraft as an example, Fisher notes that instead of merely scaring us, as more straightforward horror tends to do, weirdness captures our attentions and fascinates us. Here, Fisher distinguishes the worlds we see in Lovecraft from those we may see in what we normally think of as fantasy books. While it isn't incorrect to say that weird fiction incorporates fantastical elements, those elements usually result from an external force encroaching upon something resembling the real world, often New England in Lovecraft's case, as opposed to magical worlds like, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth or C.S. Lewis's Narnia. Fisher goes much further in describing the type of weirdness Lovecraft and other writers specialize in, and I'll include a link to a PDF of The Weird and the Eerie, along with the other sources I've used in putting this episode together in the description. And I could certainly discuss more explanations of the word weird in relation to literature, and I may want to revisit this topic at a later date. But I wanted today's episode to give you more of an idea of how I use the word weird on this channel and why I choose the pieces I've highlighted so far, as well as those I hope to explore in future episodes. And I really would love to know what you think. Please let me know in the comments if you align more with weird in the broader sense of the term, or do you prefer using it in the narrower sense, applying mainly to canonical weird writers like Lovecraft and Hodgson? Also, if you've made it this far, please like this video and consider subscribing so you can receive a notification the next time I post. Thank you so much for watching, and please keep reading. The weirder, the better.